Hi again. This is part 4 of F.F. Bruce's chapter, The Risen Lord, in his contribution to the Jesus Library, The Real Jesus. Faith and fact, and the role of the women in this section. It's important to distinguish between the resurrection faith and the resurrection fact. The resurrection faith, the belief that was awakened in the followers of Jesus that he had risen from the dead, is itself generally recognized to be a historical fact. But it is not to be confused with the resurrection fact, the fact that Jesus actually came alive after his death and burial, never to die again. The resurrection of Jesus was not on a level with the temporary restoration to life of others who had been dead for short or long periods, like Jairus' daughter or Lazarus of Bethany. What they experienced was a renewal of mortal life. In due course, that mortal life was conclusively terminated by death. But the disciples never imagined that this was what had happened to their master. His resurrection life, they understood, was a new order of existence. It was an anticipation of that life of the age to come, which many Jews of that time expected to follow the resurrection of the last day. The resurrection faith depends on the resurrection fact. Otherwise it is empty. If Christ has not been raised, said Paul to the Corinthians, if there was no resurrection fact, then your faith is vain. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 14 and 17. The resurrection fact must have a character commensurate with the quality and effect of the resurrection faith. The resurrection faith demands an adequate cause. One view that has commended itself to some scholars recently is that the resurrection faith was born in the mind of Peter, in a conversion experienced in the form of a vision, or a moment of truth bringing intellectual certainty. But while Peter certainly did undergo such an experience, to identify this experience with the resurrection fact itself is to place on it a weight which it's unable to bear. The experience of James, when the risen Christ appeared to him too, was most probably independent of Peter's, as Paul's later experience certainly was. The experiences of all three, the devoted, though temporarily defeated disciple, the unsympathetic brother, the determined persecutor, share a common cause. In all three, the resurrection faith was independently kindled, and kindled by one and the same resurrection fact. Jesus, who was crucified, was no longer dead, but alive. This is the resurrection fact which the New Testament offers us to match the resurrection faith. There are those, and I am one of them, whose instinctive response to others who have difficulty in accepting this basic New Testament presentation is to ask, as Paul did before the younger Agrippa, why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? That's Paul in Acts 26, verse 8. But it has to be realized that the intellectual climate of Western culture since the 17th or 18th century has not been congenial to the idea of the miraculous. Where a non-miraculous explanation is adequate, it is natural to prefer it. But what non-miraculous explanation is adequate to account for the resurrection fact and faith together, along with their lasting effects? Paul, I believe, was right in viewing the resurrection of Christ from the dead as the supreme manifestation of God's power. Here, in C.S. Lewis's terminology, we have a miracle of the new creation. More than that, we have the miracle by which the new creation has been brought into being. And this subhead is the role of the women. According to the resurrection accounts in the Gospels, it was not to Peter or to any other of the male disciples that the risen Lord first appeared. It was to women, and primarily to Mary Magdalene. The appearance to Mary Magdalene is vividly described in the fourth Gospel. C.H. Dodd, discussing this description, speaks of his feeling, cautiously he adds, it can be no more than a feeling, that it has something indefinably first-hand about it. It stands in any case alone. There's nothing quite like it in the Gospels. Is there anything quite like it in all ancient literature? This is the words of C.H. Dodd, one of the greatest John interpreters. And a liberal, by the way, not a conservative. Bruce says, I cannot agree with those who view the accounts of Jesus' appearance to Mary Magdalene and the other women with greater skepticism than the accounts of his appearance to Peter and the other male disciples. His appearance to the women is not likely to have been invented. For one thing, the women who are made to play a much more creditable part in the passion and resurrection narratives than that played by the male disciples. For another thing, those who preserve the accounts of Jesus' appearance to the women would have known that they were inviting disbelief in the whole resurrection message. The testimony of women, especially with regard to a matter of this kind, would simply be discounted as not to be taken seriously. According to Luke, when Mary Magdalene and her companions told the male disciples what they had seen and heard at the empty tomb, these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. That's Luke 24, verse 11. Still less would they have believed them if they had reported that they had seen the Lord himself. In later generations, the involvement of women in the gospel accounts of the resurrection was regarded as sufficient reason for dismissing the whole idea out of hand. Celsus, a 2nd century polemicist against Christianity, regarded the belief in the resurrection as based on nothing more than the hallucination of a hysterical female. Here is a sufficient reason for the silence about Jesus' appearance to the women in the early apostolic preaching. What Paul gives us in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-11, is a summary of that preaching as he had received it and as he delivered it to others in turn. No specific mention was made in it of the testimony of women. But when we consider the practical reasons against making any mention of it, the historicity of the tradition that Mary Magdalene was the first person to see the risen Lord is not put in question by its absence from the public proclamation. Next time, the time and manner of the resurrection, and that it has become the hinge event of all history. Put a link into our series, Why Jesus? Why should we pay any attention to what a Jewish rabbi 2,000 years ago said? It's a series of 4 videos we did. I'll put a link into the first one.